Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So thank you for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Peter Sutoris, who will be talking to us quite a bit about some of his latest work in the world of development. And he's done quite a bit of research in India and other parts of the world. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us. So how's it going?
Thank you for having me.
How's it going? How's this tier 4 been going for you?
Well, not great, but I'm finishing a book, so it's actually a good time just to hunker down and get it done. So in a way, I can't complain. I'm managing to keep busy and be productive.
I guess for somebody like you who's very introspective about the research that you do, because your background is filmmaking, right?
Yeah, I was a filmmaker before I was an academic. Yeah.
And so I guess this sort of period does that stimulate your sort of creative side?
To some extent, but I'm also used to being out in the world, and a lot of the research that I do involves talking to people, doing interviews, immersing myself in different communities, observing what goes on. And that's not something I'm able to do. You can do a bit of it remotely by Zoom, but it's just not the same. I think as someone who identifies as an anthropologist, I just think we need to actually spend time face to face with people.
It's very interesting that you sort of steered your research towards India. Why India?
Well, it was basically to do with a professor that I had back when I was an undergraduate in the US. I was interested in working in international development, and everyone I talked to told me that what I need to do is study economics, because that's what's going to help you get a career in that field. So I went and I took some economics courses, and I just discovered that this was quite narrow for my taste, and it didn't really answer the questions that I had about why certain countries were doing better than others economically. So then I sort of asked around, and I was told that there was a professor who was studying the history of the idea of development and how it's changed over time. And he happens to be an expert on India. So I took some of his courses. I started working for him as a research assistant. I wrote a thesis with him, ultimately published that as a book. And it was really him as a sort of mentor who influenced me in that way. So I didn't really set out to focus on India. It just sort of happened.
So let's get into the sort of the crux of your research. What does your research actually look at?
Well, it's evolved quite a bit over the years. So with my first book, I started with trying to understand, like I said, the history of development, because that was something that I sort of picked up from this mentor with whom I worked, Professor Doug Haynes in the US. And I think over time, I became quite interested also in the contemporary practice of it, and what can we learn from that history that might help us sort of improve the way development is done. And most recently, I've become interested particularly in the environmental and sustainability aspect of development, because I think it's become very clear that development has to be sensitive to environmental and sustainability concerns. It's simply not practical, not possible for all countries to follow the kind of dirty fossil fuel influenced or fossil fuel driven model that the countries of the West have followed. So I think we have to really think critically about what development means at a time of environmental crisis.
And so, in the context of India, does this research look at India? When do you look at sort of the sustainability factors that are involved in India, or is India more of an area that you sort of look at the post-colonial trajectories?
So with the first book, Visions of Development, I looked at the post-colonial trajectories and how they were reflected, particularly in films, non-fiction documentary films that were made by the Indian government after independence. But in my most recent research, I have actually become quite focused on working with young people, not just in India but also in other countries, and really trying to understand how both the education that these young people are getting and the kind of exposure that they might have to debates about the environment outside of school, how those factors shape the way that they imagine the future, not just of India, but of the whole world, really, and how they also see their role as political beings, as political agents in trying to bring that future about.
That's a very interesting sort of approach, because historically, have they perceived themselves to have any kind of political influence, or a role in the world of politics?
You could argue that that's the sort of thing that's very limited, in an education system like the one that we see in India. But I think really all over the world, to some extent, education systems are, pretty conservative. They tend to preserve the status quo. Fundamentally, I think we basically have this elephant in the room when it comes to debates about environment and sustainability and education. You look at something like UNESCO policies or UNESCO papers about sort of utilizing the potential of education to help the world become a more sustainable place, which might sound very optimistic, but then I think when you realize that these education systems are actually run by countries and governments that themselves pursue environmentally unfriendly policies, that actually these governments don't necessarily have an interest in teaching their young people to undermine the very same policies or to question the very same policies that they pursue. And so I think what we have to ask ourselves is, where is the incentive in these education systems, not just in India but in the UK, anywhere in the world really, to really promote the kind of critical thinking and the kind of political engagement which is needed, I think, for us to see any kind of significant change, significant shift in how we think about the environment, and for us to actually have a chance at dealing with the environmental crisis.
And so, in this work, do you sort of borrow from your past as a filmmaker? Do you work with them in terms of sort of, looking at documentaries, or piecing together films and seeing how they respond to that, or is it just more of a very sort of conversation like approach?
I have found that visuals are very important, because obviously there are many barriers when an anthropologist like me goes to a place like India. There are linguistic barriers, there are cultural barriers, there are barriers in perceived status, certainly all kinds of power dynamics that go on. And what I have found is that simply just sitting down someone for an interview and asking them a set of questions sometimes can be quite an intimidating experience, and it can not necessarily give you an insight into what that person is really thinking. So I think what I try to do is I try to immerse myself as much as possible, spend as much time as I can, really try and become part of the community in some way. But I also try to draw on visual methods, visual methodologies, and filmmaking in particular. I have found to be a very fruitful method in engaging with young people. There's an anthropologist in Australia, David McDougall, who pioneered this approach of what he calls observational filmmaking, where basically you teach young people how to use professional camera equipment, and it's quite important that it's professional grade equipment, because that really forces you as the person behind the camera to be very intentional about what you film and how you film it, how you frame it, how you put it together. So there's a sort of steep learning curve in the beginning, where I, as the researcher, come in and I bring this equipment and I just teach the technical skills needed to master it. And once that has been accomplished, the young people then actually take the cameras home and they spend a significant chunk of time, weeks, sometimes months, actually filming, putting together a film about a topic of their choice, about a subject that appeals to them. And invariably, you find that with the subjects that they choose, there is going to be something about the environment in which they live and something about their hopes and expectations of the future. So that becomes a really good starting point then for a conversation, about what the future actually means and what might be this person's engagement with that idea, what contribution might they be able to make. So I find that the filmmaking really stimulates those conversations in a way that I haven't seen any other medium or any other methods be as effective as that.
That's very interesting because it's a very unusual method, and it's not one that is very common. And I think you mentioned something there briefly about using the cameras and sort of to track the participants. Um, does that have its own problems? Can you sort of through the use of film create a narrative that isn't really there?
Well, I think the answer to that is that with this kind of a method, it's really the participant who is creating the narrative. In a way, once I have sort of taught the technical skills of how you use this equipment, how you frame a shot, how you might perform very basic camera movements and so on. Once I've accomplished that, it's really then up to the participant to decide, how they're going to use that knowledge and that skill. I'm not there to dictate at that point what they should do or how they should do it. And ultimately, they also do their own editing. So, once they have the footage, I teach them, basic editing techniques, and we put together a short film. And I think what I found quite interesting also is that once you have this film at the end, obviously I can read that film in a particular way, and I can bring my own assumptions or sort of responses that I have to that material to how I interpret it. But actually, because I have the film and I have the people who made the film in front of me, I can actually have a conversation with them and ask them about how they intended the film to be interpreted. So I think they also help me check my own biases and my own assumptions, in that they give me a guide as to how I should read the film that they themselves have created. So I think in that sense, I have certainly found it to be more open, to the voice of the participant than a lot of the conventional methods.
From these sort of footages that has been, or from the footage that's been recorded, what's the most striking thing that you've seen? What's the most striking example of a piece of footage that you've come across?
Well, many of them have been quite subtle. I think the young people, because they are immersed in their communities, they tend to film everyday life, and so when you and I look at it, we might think, well, this looks quite sort of everyday sort of life in this part of the world. Doesn't necessarily seem all that striking. But I think when you take a closer look and when you talk to the people who made these films, oftentimes you find that actually there are some really interesting things that they're doing. For example, I remember a film that was made in with a group of people in South Africa, in South Durban, which is one of the places in the world with the greatest air pollution because of the petrochemical industry and other industries in that area. And the young people decided to go and film a soccer match that was happening in front of an oil refinery, where you can see these huge smokestacks and just these large quantities of chemicals being released into the air, and you can see these children playing soccer in front of this building, which is quite a striking visual. But of course, for these children, that's their everyday life. And then they would go and they would sort of speak to the different children who were present at the game, and kind of ask them what their experience is of living in that sort of environmentally polluted area. And you find that for many of them, it's just a very sort of everyday ritual of existence. That you go and you play this soccer game in front of an oil refinery, and you inhale all this noxious fumes. So I think you see scenes like that, and you think, okay, this is a real bridge here. I mean, for them it's something that's very everyday. For me, it is actually very very striking, because I would not expect to see this anywhere in the world. I think this is very problematic that this is happening. So I think scenes like that, they really get you thinking.
It's very striking. It is very striking in so many ways, because those individuals might not necessarily be that worried about what they're inhaling, or they might be very worried, but they have nothing that they can do about it because they're so sort of politically relevant, and they can't dictate what goes on there. So in these sorts of scenes, I mean, what are the sort of what are the reactions of some of the people that the kids interview? Is it just they're just going about life as usual, or is there some concern about sort of the fumes and the pollution that they're living in?
Well, there's definite concern and there's definite awareness, and I think that was one of the reasons why I chose, the research sites that I choose tend to be sites where there's a direct exposure to environmental issues. So in South Africa, in this particular site, it was air pollution. I had another research site in India where I was looking at a group of people who were displaced because of a large dam that the government built. So in those kinds of cases, the everyday life is very much shaped by these environmental threats that those of us living in London, or living in places where we may not be directly facing the level of environmental damage or environmental threats that some of these fence line communities face. We may not be fully aware of it. We might know that this is coming. We are entering the environmental crisis, but in some ways, I think these communities live. I call it accelerated time. They live in the future in some ways. They've already experiencing what the rest of us might get to experience down the line. And I think what that does is that it really forces you as a young person, when you are trying to picture your own life and your own future in a community like this, where you can see that the community is being destroyed. It really forces you to think. And I think it makes you, in my experience, it makes you really reflect on your political agency. And that's what I was really interested in. What do these children, these young people think about their ability to bring about a different world, to change the course of the world? And that was also quite an optimistic picture, in a sense that I really saw that this kind of exposure, for all of its problems, you could say the silver lining is that it really encourages young people to think of themselves as activists, as people who might want to change the world in some way.
Mhm. That's very interesting. Obviously, as an anthropologist, your sort of your work is really centered in tracking changes and tracking how things develop over time. Um, in your sort of years of research, whether it's in India, whether it's in parts of Africa, what has been the most concerning thing for you?
Oh, that's a big question. I think working in those spaces, you sort of become exposed to concerning things all the time, and I think to some extent you also maybe have to become a bit desensitized to them, in order to be able to function in those spaces. But I would say that to me, the most concerning thing is apathy, and it's the kind of uh, sort of giving up on the future, giving up on your own ability as a human being to affect change. It's something that I think I have perhaps seen more with teachers in the schools where I've done research than with the young people. I think sometimes if you are a teacher who's stuck in a heavily bureaucratic system where you are teaching year after year a curriculum which is basically all about maintaining the status quo, which is all about infinite growth. It's all about the kinds of very problematic ideas, I think, that underpin some of our societies. You, I think, do become potentially quite hopeless, or lacking hope, about the future. But I think really the work with young people in some ways counterbalances that, because you can see that there is a new generation, which maybe has a different take, and which doesn't sort of give into apathy. I would imagine that some of the people that I worked with eventually might, but I think some of them will not, and I think some of them will be able to sort of go forward and create some kind of meaningful change.
And so you have a book that's coming out next year. For
Mhm.
the sort of purpose of the audience, give them a sort of a little blurb of what the book would contain.
Okay, I always with this book I always struggle to summarize it in brief terms, but I'll try. The title is "Educating for the Anthropocene." The Anthropocene is a concept which comes out of geology. It's basically the idea that humanity or the planet has now entered this new geological period, which is characterized by human influence on the planet. So, humans really sort of become a force of geological magnitude, that we really alter the sort of fundamentals of the earth in some ways. And in the book, what I'm asking is the question of, what that really means for education. We hear a lot about education for the 21st century, for example. That's a buzzword that gets used a lot in academia. Um, and I think oftentimes what is meant by that is educating young people to be able to use information technology, to think critically, to work with information. But I think the Anthropocene is from my point of view, a much more significant marker, a significant milestone in the history of the world, that we have now reached this point where the fate of the planet is in our hands. And not just the fate of the planet. I mean, the fate of humanity. I think, all the achievements that humanity has created in all the fields of knowledge, culture, art, all of that is on the line. All of that could go within a matter of generations if we don't change course, I think. And so, what does it mean for education um, to actually engage, with young people when we have entered this period? How do you prepare someone for such a challenge? How do you encourage ethical, responsible living, at the time of the Anthropocene? I think those are really central questions from my point of view, and I just haven't really seen, I think, enough focus and enough attention paid both within academia and within policy government circles to these questions.
Where are you taking your research next?
Um, I'm more interested now in the applications of my research than doing
Uh-huh.
any sort of real fundamentally new research. So I'm interested in continuing with this idea of educating for the Anthropocene and really looking at spaces for inspiration. Because I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think educating for the Anthropocene is already happening. It may not be happening in mainstream schools in many countries, but I think it is happening at the community level. It is happening among activist groups. It is, happening perhaps in religious groups as well to some extent. And I think it's really interesting for us to study, what kinds of values, information, skills are transmitted in those spaces, and what we can learn from that for improving, the sort of schooling and education systems that we have. So I'm really interested in that, and I'm also really interested in working with educators, working with policymakers, to actually come up with frameworks and curricula, teaching aids, approaches that we could actually pilot in schools, and seeing how young people and how teachers respond to them. So I think that kind of a more applied direction is where I'm planning to move next.
I think that's fantastic, and because it's an initiative that's embedded in academic research and in research that you've done firsthand, it gives it that much more depth and practicality. So, I know you have a website, peterstories.com, where people can
Mhm.
find you online. Are you on Twitter by any chance?
I have to admit that I am not. I think as someone who's quite involved and interested in environmental issues, I've tried to limit my exposure to social media. But I think I am now recognizing that to have a voice and to have an influence, it is quite important. So it's possible that you might find me on Twitter soon, but not just yet.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me. And I think, as I said, I think your work is incredible. And the fact that you've taken the steps to sort of apply into everyday education is something that's fantastic, and we hope more academics, tend towards. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to have you on sometime soon.
Sounds good. And I would perhaps just say that, in that effort to reach beyond academia, I'm always looking for collaborators. So if any listeners are interested in getting in touch, please do.
Excellent. And we'll connect all your sort of contact details and email to the show so people can get direct access to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.